New Zealand defeated India in the first of the inaugural edition of the World Test Championship. 2 years later, and they've finished 6th. That's quite a drop. Even if you thought they were a bit lucky last time and that their schedule played a part, it's hard to argue that in that edition they were in the top 3 teams. And now Kane Williamson and whatever was left of Neil Wagner had to steal a single to not lose at home against Sri Lanka. So things have changed. But what exactly? And I think the best way to have a look at that is to work out what made them successful in the first cycle. Weirdly enough, New Zealand did not start that cycle particularly well. They drew a series 1-1 in Sri Lanka, and they were then whitewashed 3-0 by Australia. My call at that stage for them to make the final looked a little shaky. But Sri Lanka is a tough matchup for the Kiwis, being that they have no obvious frontline spinner, and that's the place where it spins the most in the world. They also don't really have a secondary spinner, or really any spinners they could trust at that stage. And when it comes to Australia, well, it doesn't really seem to matter how good or bad they are at any time. When they play to Australia, they generally lose. But what the Kiwis did next was pretty impressive. They now knew that they had to deliver at home, and they whitewashed a very strong Indian unit 2-0. But before anyone could even start to work out what this all meant, COVID happened. And while many of us had bigger things to worry about, the World Test Championship also had to react to what was going on, in the world. So the ICC, which already had a fairly flawed league going on as it was, had to change the rule from the most points to the percentage of points scored. This essentially made it tougher for teams playing more games. And it was already a tournament that was harder for teams who were playing more games. New Zealand barely play any tests, so it was kind of perfect for them. They also got on a bit of a roll. They demolished the West Indies and Pakistan at home, but even then they still relied a fair bit on other results. It took an amazing yet kind of freaky series win from India when they travelled down under. But also for the Aussies, they actually got points docked for slow over rate at a test at the MCG. And there was also the cancellation of a couple of key tours, New Zealand going to Bangladesh and Australia going to South Africa. And by the end of that, it meant that New Zealand was guaranteed a final place. They still had to win it, of course, which they did. And none of this means that New Zealand weren't good. Remember that they didn't just fluke a couple of wins. They had been improving in Test cricket for a long time, with a decades-old plan to be more relevant in that format of the game. Their ascension had something to do with the fact that their first-class players had gone on strike to become professionals almost 20 years earlier, that their player development setup was incredible. The first-class pitches were all changed, and other small things that they did along the way. But the actual final space fell to them through T. Natarajan's greatest moment, a team actually being penalised for slow over rates, and a worldwide pandemic that killed millions and also changed the rules of the competition they were already in. And of course, in the WTC, the most important thing is always to look at the schedule, because it is so batshit insane. This is in no way a proper league. In terms of difficulty, there really wasn't much to separate between the last 2 cycles. The home season was arguably easier for New Zealand this time around. However, the away tours were always going to be a little bit more challenging. This time on the road from 7 test matches, they didn't win any of them. They lost 4, but they drew 3. Last time on the road, they won 1 and lost 4. So the real difference here was what happened at home. Because in that previous cycle, New Zealand went 6-0. And this time they went 4-2. But 2 of those wins came when they were already well out of contention. Kane Williamson was their most valuable batter in that first edition, although he didn't really score any runs on the road, but he was magnificent at home. And his elbow injury did not allow him to play 4 tests versus Bangladesh and South Africa in the 2022 home summer. That's a big player to miss. And while they had a few notable retirements in this period, it is worth looking if they had a significant impact on the team as a whole. Because Ross Taylor was clearly not at his best in the first World Test Championship, averaging only 33. Now, he did get worse in the next one, averaging only 17, but he also didn't play in all the matches. BJ Watling averaged under 28 in their successful campaign. Compare that to the person who replaced him, Tom Blundell, who averages 43 in this cycle. There's no doubt that Watling and Taylor were incredible servants for New Zealand cricket, but losing them hasn't really affected how they've gone in this World Test Championship. In fact, they arguably upgraded their batting strengths, with Daryl Mitchell and Devon Conway coming in to become first-choice batters in the playing 11. And right at the moment, Tom Blundell has one of the highest batting averages of any wicketkeeper batter in the history of the game. But they did lose other players as well. Colin de Grandhomme had turned himself into a very good number 7 bat and a very handy 5th choice bowler. The sort that would get you crucial wickets with the ball when he wasn't just going at a very low economy rate. And of course, with the bat lower on, he could do a lot of damage. He played in 7 test matches of the first World Test Championship and only 3 in the second due to a heel injury, which he eventually retired from. But perhaps the biggest difference was that their entire bowling unit was at its absolute best during that first cycle. They probably had the best seam bowling attack in the world with Trent Boult, Tim Southee, Neil Wagner, and of course they added Kyle Jamieson to that. You chuck in Colin de Grandhomme, that's a lot of options with the ball and also a little bit with the bat with Jamieson and de Grandhomme. They absolutely destroyed teams with the ball. And that did not happen in the second cycle. They went from being the second best bowling team in the world in WTC 1 to the sixth best in WTC 2. And we haven't even talked about Trent Boult yet. And remember that New Zealand Cricket released him from his central contract in August. This meant that he was clearly going to play a lot less international cricket. But it's also worth noting that by that point, a lot of the damage had been done. But whether it be WTC 1 or WTC 2, the bigger problem for New Zealand has always been spin. And during this cycle, New Zealand did have to go to India and Pakistan. Remember that New Zealand had won a test match in Sri Lanka during World Test Championship 1, but that was a very, very poor Sri Lankan side. In this cycle, they did not win a single test in 4 matches versus India and Pakistan. And look, it's a lot tougher to tour India than it is Sri Lanka. And the fact that they managed a non-negative result on their Indian tour, like a draw, was actually fairly good. That was better than what I assumed they would get from that series. And then they went to Pakistan, who created some of the flattest wickets of all time in their series during that World Test Championship, which obviously nullified the impact of spin bowling, and kind of all bowling. And New Zealand had watched Australia and England win there. They had templates to follow, and a broken Pakistan team that they should have exploited. And you look at their bowling from that series, and they got surprisingly great numbers from Ish Sodhi. Bracewell held up really well as their fifth option, and Tim Southee chipped away. They probably only needed one of Ajaz Patel, Matt Henry, and Neil Wagner to complement the other three, and they win a test. And so that meant that they struggled in Asia, and they struggled at home, and they couldn't overcome both of those things. However, the weird thing about all this is when you look at New Zealand in the second cycle, they actually look like overall they might have a better team. Conway, Mitchell and Blundell are all performing way better than their previous players had. Patel, Sodhi, Bracewell and Rachin Ravindra are a better spin unit than they've had in like a very, very long time. Of course, the big losses are de Grandhomme and Boult, but there are certainly enough pluses to cover that, and Boult did play a bit. So you really have to then break it down on a test-by-test basis. What were the games that really cost New Zealand? So I've come up with 3 pretty important ones before we even get to the England series. When Bangladesh beat them, they did so by scoring over 400 runs at Mount Maunganui against an attack of Boult, Wagner, Jamieson and Southee. Yeah, the dream team. And it wasn't like there was some big innings from Tamim Iqbal or Shakib Al Hasan. Neither of them were even on the tour. And no Bangladeshi batter made 100. They just all handed this all-star bowling lineup. That's pretty unlikely. The second was the match against South Africa at home, where they allowed the terrible Protea batting lineup to score over 300 runs against them twice in a match. A feat that the South Africans managed only on one other occasion in this entire cycle. The bowling attack in that match was Wagner, de Grandhomme, Jamieson, Matt Henry and Tim Southee. Again, a pretty good bowling lineup. And then the third match that should be mentioned was where Pakistan and New Zealand played out a classic end to a test match. All New Zealand needed was a wicket from the final 21 balls and their bowlers couldn't find it. You just feel that if any of these 3 matches were in the previous cycle, they would all go completely different. For instance, if Williamson was fit and he played at Mount Maunganui against Bangladesh, probably makes a pretty big score, which means that New Zealand have the upper hand in that game, not Bangladesh. And how many times would this broken South African batting lineup make 600 runs against an attack this good? I'm going to guess not many. And if you threw the Pakistan tail in for 21 balls, I think you'd want to believe that at least 50% of the time you would get them out. And I haven't even got to the biggest thing that happened to New Zealand. The entire world played England and had a great time going up against them like they were a giant piñata. And then New Zealand plays them right at the beginning of Bazball, which was a different proposition that none of us even understood, and certainly the way New Zealand played, they did not. And having a look at the way New Zealand played, they certainly didn't get it. And that happened to merge with the fact that the balls went completely flat, and they were pretty easy to smash after the 20th over, helping what England was doing massively. If the balls were normal, it would have just been a bowling shootout, like England-South Africa was a couple of months later. That probably favours New Zealand a lot more, and a worst case scenario, they probably lose that series 2-1. But remember that in those first 2 tests against England, they had injuries to bowlers that completely changed everything. To make it worse in the last test, they also only went in with 3 specialist bowlers. But also, you need to remember that New Zealand set England nearly 300 in 3 straight tests. You would expect England to stuff that up at least once, right? So if you look at cycle 2 and you just have a quick lightning round, New Zealand somehow lost at home to a Bangladesh work experience batting lineup. They allowed the worst batting lineup in South African memory to score on them twice. They couldn't dismiss the Pakistan number 10 or number 11, and they somehow managed to walk into England's killing machine thanks to flat balls and a man called Brendan McCullum, who of course was the architect of their rise to win the previous World Test Championship. In other words, all the things that went right for them in that first cycle went wrong for them in the second one. And so they went from first to not even relevant.